Okay, Gabe added a read-only item that he's traveling today and will miss this meeting. He does miss us all and prefers collaborating with us than traveling, so he can't wait until he's back tomorrow. So that's sweet. Kushal, you wanted to talk about the GraphQL on the roadmap page.
Yeah, so although I've written a lot of points, I just wanted to make sure that I don't derail the conversation while explaining what's happening here. So this is about roadmap page. So as you all know that we are slowly moving away from traditional Rails API for everything that we do on the portfolio management side over to GraphQL. So that means that we want to make use of GraphQL in the roadmap page as well. But with that comes some concerns. Like right now, what happens is that Rails API that we are using to load all the epics on the roadmap page, the API returns back with all the epics that are present. So that means that if you today go to gitlab.com and visit a roadmap page on the GitLab org group, it has 1500 epics, but out of those, somewhere close to 500 epics have start or finish dates or both. And that means that we load up all 500 epics on roadmap page at once. And obviously, this is not very performant. The delay in how long it takes for API to return those 500 results is itself a tad bit slower. It might be even slower on slow connections. At the same time, scrolling within the page itself feels a bit slower than it used to be because we are now rendering all 500 nodes at once. So that is obviously a performance problem that we need to solve. But now that we are planning to integrate GraphQL on the roadmap page, the thing about GraphQL API itself is that it will return only 100 results per page. That means is that if we were to merge this merge request, which integrates GraphQL onto the production, user won't be seeing more than 100 items. So we need a way to have basically some sort of pagination on scroll for it to work. Now, as I mentioned, like what are the complications that come with the GraphQL integration? So these are the 5 points that I mentioned here. So the first thing is that we have endless horizontal scrolling within the timeline, which means that if you scroll into the future or into the past, we would load up results from future or past, depending on which direction user scrolls in. And we would insert those epics into the existing list while making sure that the sort order that user has selected is respected. So that means that insertions would happen anywhere within the list, depending on where exactly that epic falls in as per the currently selected sort order. So that is one feature that we are doing right now. And plus, sorting itself happens on the client side. Like once results arrive, we do the sorting on what we are showing on UI, and then everything is rendered. Fortunately, on UI, it is not very noticeable because Vue is smart enough to make sure that insertions that happen in a new place are the only ones where, the insertion of item is basically happening visually. Like behind the scenes, a lot of things are going on, but visually you wouldn't notice like, okay, all the items got shuffled around because something was sorted. So that's a good thing. But once we have the GraphQL integration, we would only be seeing 100 items per page. So once user scrolls at the end of the list, we would append 100 more items. With that, sorting becomes a problem because how we would do the sorting then? The problem is that it might be possible that one of the items which was supposed to be at the top of the list, as per the currently selected sorting order, is now at the bottom of the list because backend doesn't perform any kind of sorting on the results itself. So that is the whole problem. And the performance, as I mentioned, is already something that we need to look at as soon as possible. Because right now we are only having 500 epics with the dates. And even with 500 items, it is starting to become a scrolling problem essentially. So in order to make the scrolling behavior itself faster, we need to make sure that we do not render everything at once. We only render what's needed, which is also called as buffered rendering. So at any given point of time on a page, user only sees somewhere like 30 to 35 epics at once. We don't need to render 500 items. We just can show only the items which are visible essentially. So that is one thing. Now, what are the options to solve it? So one thing is obviously we would need some sort of buffered rendering where we would only show what matters on the viewport, and we would take away any items which are not currently part of UI. So that's one thing. And then once user scrolls upwards or downwards, basically any vertical scrolling that happens, we would append or remove items on the list. So that's one thing. And we would continue to do insertions on horizontal scroll as it is. Like if user scrolls into the past or future, we would insert items within the list as it is. So that's the second thing. And then sorting would apply only on what's visible on the viewport. And this is the important one. Here, what we will do is that if user is seeing only 35 items at once on screen, our sorting will be applied only on those 35 items which are on UI. We won't do any kind of sorting on what's outside the viewport. But that is a problem in case user wants to scroll all the way to the bottom of the list in case they are looking for something specific. So that's one problem. Although there is a workaround for this, like if user knows that what exact epic they are looking for, like based on a epic title or description or author or label, then we already have filtered search bar for this. Like they can directly apply search and then hit enter, and then they would be seeing only what matters. But at times we might not know what exact epic title we are looking for, and we just know that it is somewhere in the list. And if user is scrolling around the list, then that is a problem because sort order would look out of place as user starts to scroll entire list at once. So that is one problem. So another alternative in combination with first option is to basically move entire sorting logic to backend. And it is easier to do so because GraphQL already has a threshold of 100 items. So once API returns back, we can do the sorting. I'm not sure if that can be done on a controller level or a helper level, depending on how backends wants to do it. But we basically move entire sorting logic into the backend so that we don't have to do any sorting on front end. We would just append the results as they come by. So that is one approach. And then we continue with the rest of the approach, as I mentioned in the first part, where we would do buffered rendering and everything. And I see a question, Sean, that what is sorting logic currently? It is based on start and end. Yes, it is based on dates essentially, but depending on what user is selected from that sort dropdown that we show on top of the roadmap view, which is combination of the dropdown itself with start and finish dates, as well as sorting direction, like whether it is ascending or descending. So depending on what user is selected there, we use that logic to perform sorting on client side.
Okay, but we don't, there's no reason we couldn't sort it on the back end side is just what I was trying to check there, basically. Like there's no...
Yes, I believe the original reason why we didn't do on the back end was because if user scrolls into the future where certain start date comes up into the future, then chances are that that particular item might fall somewhere between the list instead of end of the list. And I recall I had a conversation with Pedro and Annabelle when we were working on the sorting part, was that we didn't want to append results as they come in at the bottom of the list because it would just feel out of place. We decided to do the insertion depending on where exactly it falls for that particular sort order. Because if we were to append the list, it is much simpler problem. We just continue to append the results, and we wouldn't care how timeline looks like. Like if you go to production currently, you would notice that epics kind of the timeline of individual epics look kind of like a ladder where they start with the start date and then it continues to tilt towards end date. But things would look out of place in case we just append the list into the item instead of inserting at a specific position.
Okay. So, Donald, you also had a question, I think.
Yeah, so I think the other option here is to keep it as is, so match the current API approach that we have, but on GraphQL. So essentially, if we're able to pull in all the epics through GraphQL, there's nothing we have to do right now on the front end or on the back end if we choose to sort on the back end. Have we, and I know we ran into this issue with the epic tree around the 100 limit. Did we do all the research to see if there's a way around that? Can we implement some kind of...
So as far as as far as epic trees are concerned, we ended up adding show more link there. Like if there are more than 100 items, we would click on show more and then it would show up.
Yeah, but so are we sure it's that 100 limit is a hard limit? Like we can't get more than 100 in a single call? And we may not know the answer to that yet without doing more research. But I feel like, because the idea with this issue was just to, we didn't account for the complexities of determining like the buffered rendering or updating sort. So if we can somehow just make it a kind of one-to-one switch for this release, and then come back to the optimizations in a further release or in a future release, that would be ideal. But if it can't happen, then we'll have to just switch things around for this.
Jan, do you know? I mean, I guess you're probably the person on the call most likely to know, like, whether the limits like that in GraphQL are overridable by what you're requesting.
I'm sorry, I got distracted. The question is if we can override limits in GraphQL, which are,
yes.
You mean by client or?
I don't know. I guess it would be like for this specific query, we know that we want to be able to return more than 100 items. So I guess we could create an endpoint that wraps GraphQL that sets the limit higher, but then we're not actually using GraphQL on the front end. So
I will have to check. So I'm not sure about hard-coded limits, but if we rely only computing the complexity overall, which sometimes depends on maximum limit, then we can tune it per each request or dynamically. So not sure offhand if we can do this.
Okay, so it sounds like we should check that. We should create an issue, maybe a new issue, or move this conversation to the original issue for GraphQL on roadmap page to determine which of the first two options we want to move toward, ideally in the future, but possibly this release if we have to. But I think that's the action items from that, right? Let's check the limit, and then we'll figure out which option we want to select.
Yeah, I will take a look after the call.
Cool. Any other discussion you want to have on that, Kushal?
Nope, that is it.
Cool. Me next. Yeah, so we started creating some new backend boards. I'm actually just going to share my screen real quick, just for the benefit of the video. So hopefully that's sharing a Chrome window, which is now showing a board. So yeah, we needed to change the boards anyway, because previously we had a backend board that was plan wide, and now we have you know, two different backend teams, one managed by me and one managed by John. So for the project management team, I've created a board like this, and I think John's got a similar one elsewhere. So this is actually a generic-ish, what we're calling a build board. Like, so Geo have these as well. So it's like the project management group on the current milestone, and then it's the workflow stages that sort of apply to individual engineers working on stuff. You know, the ready for development planning breakdown I've included as well, because that needs engineering input blocked and on from there. So to see what backend engineers need to work on, they filter by backend, and then they can pick things from ready for development, or, you know, break down things in planning breakdown. There's also a column right at the end for community contributions, just to sort of hide those, because we need those on a milestone to keep aware of them, but we don't actually need anybody to assign themselves to them. So that having that column at the end just moves them out of the way. And then Donald, I think you created a similar board for plan, because front end is still one team across the whole stage. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. So it's the exact same board that you have there, just for the entire stage. Just so it's a little bit easier for the front end team who do work on all three groups essentially, in kind of order of specialties. But it's a little easier for the engineers to look at just a single board as opposed to having to look at three different boards. I think I linked in there.
Awesome. Yeah, I should link this one actually. One issue we will have with these is that we have these set of workflow labels that say whether something's ready for development or in review or whatever. But obviously we can have an issue at the moment where the backend work is in development and the front end's ready for development, or vice versa, or even it could be in verification for one or the other, but not the other. So we don't have great options there, and we're still discussing it in the issue, whether that means separate issues, whether that means we always use the lowest, the furthest left workflow label, whether we do something else. So we do know we need to address that. We haven't done it yet. Did anybody have any questions about that?
Wouldn't that be an ideal use case for a sub epic, and you have the multiple issues underneath that, one for the front end and one for the back end?
Yeah, maybe. I think someone did bring this up in the issue. Maybe they didn't. So the problem there is that the epic itself can't go on the board, and
right.
From a planning perspective, up until it reaches planning breakdown, that should be on the board, right? And then when it reaches planning breakdown, I guess we'd promote the issue to an epic and then create two child issues of that, which isn't
that would be
impossible.
The breakdown process, I would think,
yeah.
Because the breakdown is where you then split it. Because this goes back to, I know we're working on, having issues that can block other issues and that type of thing. This is an ideal use case why that feature, I think, is beneficial to our team as well, because in an ideal world, when you do that breakdown, that's where you'd assign, the front and back end work, and those would be two issues underneath a parent issue or parent epic, and it's what we currently have implemented.
Yeah, I think it might be the answer to that. I'm not 100% sure because, for instance, if you have two issues, it's quite easy, and this is again a problem we could fix. But it's quite easy to for someone not to realize that, oh, I've got the last issue in this epic, so once I'm done with this, the epic can be closed, and we can move on. So yeah, probably worth bringing that up in the issue. I think that's a reasonable case to make, that that the planning breakdown is where that change happens. If it needs to, obviously we wouldn't do it for issues where we don't need to break them down into multiple issues, because it would just be a waste of time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Hi, Mark, as well. Nice to meet you after you joined.
Yes.
Cool. Any other thoughts on that one? If not, then John, you can take over.
Yeah, sure. This last one's pretty straightforward. We have a bit of an issue. Let's see. So I was kind of wondering, not definition of done, because that's for merge requests, but do we have a kind of process documented anywhere where we define delivered for a milestone? And specifically, for the kind of corner case that we encountered there recently, where the thing was delivered but behind a feature flag. The feature flag belonged to a previous feature which was considered delivered even though it was behind the feature flag. And yeah, so there were a couple of regressions which complicates things a little bit. But I was wondering, had this come up before? When do we consider something like a feature delivered? So in this case, the feature was delivered in time for, was deployed to production in time to make the milestone, but was behind a feature flag that we couldn't turn off, so nobody was using it. But so technically you would say maybe it didn't make the milestone, but that's not consistent with that same feature flag in the past where a feature was delivered but behind the feature flag and was considered delivered. So I'm wondering what thoughts are on that.
So if it's behind a feature flag that is off by default, then it doesn't go in the release post, right?
Right.
So I think, as far as I'm aware, and I'm not 100% sure, maybe Donald or somebody else has a better handle on how this works right now than me. As far as I'm aware, delivered basically means can go in the release post if applicable. So like, if it was just like, a front-end refactor, then obviously it wouldn't go in the release post. But, for something like this, if it's a feature, then I think that's the thing, unless we initially planned for it to be behind a feature flag and then the remove the feature flag issue or something was the one that corresponded to the release post item. Donald, do you have anything? I mean, you got to have a better answer than that, I guess.
I don't, unfortunately, because I think there isn't, like, we don't have a definition company wide. Like, I mean, the real question is like, when do we close the issue? And I think as we start using feature flags more and more, that becomes a little harder to answer. Because, and especially as we kind of separate the GitLab.com releases from our self-managed releases. So I don't have a better answer, other than what we're doing now is just, we're not closing, we're not done until I think the feature is, the feature flag is defaulted to being on or being available to the feature is being available to everyone by default.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit on it there. It's two things. Like, one thing's the feature being delivered, and the other one is the issue being closed. This issue like spawned two regression issues, but also a third issue to switch the feature flag on, off, on for on by default, right? And so the next step was planned in 3 separate issues. So the question is, could we close this current issue as part of the current milestone, or do we consider it open until the whole feature is delivered?
I would say normally you can close it. The exception might be, and this might be an example of if it's an issue where a lot of people are participating or watching it, then you want to like clarify when you close it that like, hey, this is closed because it's in this state. This is the follow-up issue when it will like be fully done. Like, obviously it's better to be more explicit and more transparent in general, but especially in ones where people might be a member of the wider community or something might be saying like, hey, you closed this issue, but I don't see this anywhere. Like, why have you closed it? Like, it's not done. So yeah, I think it's reasonable to close it if that's the state, and I think that's what you did, right?
Sorry, this seems like another example of hierarchy of issues and sub epics. We have got multiple features that rely. I mean, this should really be a sub epic. If there's multiple things that have to happen afterwards, this portion is done, but the follow-on work is still there. I'm running the same thing as I'm planning things out, because you kind of need to take the first step, but that doesn't really get you where you need to go. It's just the first step, and then there's multiple steps beyond that that should be tied together somehow. So you recognize that it's a progression of effort.
Yeah, I think like the context also is different from if you look at it from a product perspective versus from a technical engineering perspective. From an engineer's point of view, you just want to close the issue, fulfill the requirements of the issue, and then either create new issues to follow on and close that one. From a product perspective, it's like, is it ready for the release post? But
I think that's the joy of that, because you can then say, okay, this is done. We're closing that issue. And that issue blocked the follow-on work. So now those issues pop up and can be worked one at a time. And you're closing out small units of work, which is, in an ideal world, when you're planning on the engineering side, I would think you would rather have small units of finite amounts of work and not these long issues that drag out indefinitely. It's better to break it down and be able to actually close out one thing, close out the next thing, and work progressively through.
Yeah, and that's like fulfills the iteration value as well.
Right.
Where we want to keep everything small and deliver it quickly. But this was just a corner case because of the feature flag. And because the feature
The
flag
feature-
was associated with a past feature and not this one,
Yeah.
you know, it's kind of...
Feature flags do make it more complicated.
Cool. That's it.
Okay, great. Well, have a great rest of your day, everybody, and speak to you all soon. Thanks.